Hello and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about Prince Hal and Falstaff from the plays Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2. These are two of my favorite characters in terms of Hal being this really interesting person who's a young man who becomes king eventually at the end of Part 2 of the plays. And Falstaff, who is a great character. Not enough great things can be said about him. He's just really witty and really funny. And so I'm going to focus on them and their bromance that they have, this great relationship they have. It's sort of father-son, but also best friends. So Prince Hal is young Henry V. He becomes king at the end of Part 2 of Henry IV. And he is I would really like to see him portrayed sometime as sort of a young college boy, kind of a frat boy who goes to parties, does all these like sort of crazy antics because he's young and carefree, but knows that eventually he's going to have to focus and settle up and realize that he's going to have to become king someday. Falstaff, meanwhile, is this interesting character who's not really a fool, he's not a clown, he's a comic character, very much so, but there's also sort of a serious edge to him where he's a sort of surrogate father figure for Prince Hal. Prince Hal, his father is Henry IV, he's busy ruling the country of England, he's torn up with grief for having killed Richard II in order to become king, and there's this sort of weird tension between Hal and Henry IV, in which Henry really wants Hal to be serious, but Hal doesn't really care about that at this point in time, it seems, and Falstaff kind of steps in and provides this different sort of education for Hal that he isn't getting being a young prince. Falstaff is a really popular character of study, especially among academics, because he's such an interesting one. He's sometimes simplified down to a lord of misrule, but I would agree with people who say that he's much more than that. He's very complicated. He does things like steal and get drunk and do crazy things, but he's not amoral. He's also has a very sort of center about him, in which he really cares about Hal. He really cares about helping this young boy, and so he's sort of transcends any sort of easy characterization. He's very complicated in ways that you wouldn't expect from someone so humorous, and I really think that's interesting. Now, one of the big arguments that surrounds the relationship between Hal and Falstaff is who is the more pivotal character. Even though Hal becomes king, and the plays are called the Henriad and this series, some people argue that the plays are very much more about Falstaff and about Falstaff's relationship with Hal. And I would agree in some ways with that Falstaff is very much a principal character. In fact, if Falstaff were not in these plays, Hal would be a much different person. And I think that because Hal knows Falstaff, he becomes a better king in the end because he has this relationship with a different class than the one he would be in otherwise. And this, I think, saves him from being too Machiavellian. He is still Machiavellian if you read Henry V. There are some instances where you're like, whoa, Hal, what are you doing, man? But other times he's much more understanding, I think, of the other people in England that maybe if he had been stayed only in this higher sphere in the castle with his father and with the lords and so on who worked there, that he wouldn't have gained this different understanding. And so by being part of this, like, lower class, so to say, like going to taverns and hanging out with Falstaff and getting into trouble, he gains this understanding that he wouldn't otherwise have. So by having this relationship with Falstaff, he really is set up for having different experiences and different ideas about being a king that I think other king characters in Shakespeare don't really have. I mean, if Richard III had different experiences, maybe he would have been less diabolical. Maybe it's in his nature, as he always likes to say. But I think definitely having these experiences sets up Henry for a very different perspective on kingship, and he doesn't really focus on becoming king until he absolutely has to, until his father becomes ill and he knows that his time has come, he has to step up and become king, which then leads us to probably my least favorite scene thus far in Shakespeare. So this scene involves Falstaff finding out that Henry IV has died, Prince Hal, now Henry V, has become king, and he very much wants to go see his old friend and pay his respects. And so he goes to the coronation, interrupts this grand setting to be like, hey, remember me? I'm your best friend. Remember me? And which Prince Hal then does this. So Falstaff shows up, and he says his greetings, and very much wants to be recognized by the king, in which Henry V replies, I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers, how ill white hairs become a fool and jester. And it's just sad. It's very sad. I recently saw a movie version of this, and I tried very hard not to cry and kind of didn't succeed. It's just a very heartbreaking scene, I think, because anyone who's ever had friendship problems, ever fought with a friend, ever had to end a friendship because of certain reasons, whether they be because they're a bad influence on you or because you just have differences, you really understand this scene. I mean, it's between a rock and a hard place for Hal here because he has to become king. He has to leave Falstaff aside. He has to leave his youth behind and become king. But it also really sucks because he has a great friendship with Falstaff, and Falstaff seems like the sort of person that you would want by your side as king, but at the same time, he's not exactly ruling materially. You really could see Falstaff becoming part of the court, but that would probably not be the best choice for Hal because Falstaff is so unpredictable and you never really know what he's going to do. And so it's this tricky situation in which Hal has to leave his past behind in order to take on this new role, but he breaks Falstaff's heart to do it, and no, I don't like it at all. The way in which this friendship ends also brings about questions of whether or not Hal was ever really sincere in his friendship with Falstaff, and that's something that I think that he really was. He did actually care about Falstaff. He spent a lot of time with him. Like, I don't think he would have done that if he hadn't, like, earnestly wanted to be with Falstaff and hang out with him and see his perspective on things. I think the entire time he obviously knows that he has to become king eventually, that he's going to have to leave Falstaff, which makes it an interesting relationship. But I don't think that makes it any the less sincere, which then during the scene is really hard to deal with. I mean, it's a completely public refusal to recognize Falstaff, and that's, no. I'm done talking about this scene. So let's talk about something happier. Let's talk about how witty Falstaff is, because Falstaff is very, very witty. In part 1, he says some really, really wonderful things, including my favorite, "Were it not here apparent that thou art heir apparent," making a nice pun on heir apparent and apparent, clearly. And he's super funny. He's great and wonderful and has some of the best Shakespearean insults ever written. It's also interesting because there are some theories out there that Falstaff is the most Shakespearean character in the terms that Shakespeare put a lot of himself into this character. And some people theorize that Falstaff is actually Shakespeare as a person in the play, which if that's the case, Shakespeare would have been a totally awesome person to hang out with. He would have gotten in so much trouble and it probably sucked the next morning, but you would have had a lot of fun. And I think that's really interesting if that were the case to see how Shakespeare appears in his own plays. Now, the funny thing here is that I've been talking about Henry IV Part 1 and 2 without really talking about Henry IV, and I think that's what's so interesting about these plays is that despite their names, they're less about Henry IV and more about Prince Hal, and especially with the focus on Falstaff and the argument that it is actually all about Falstaff. I really regret having not read The Merry Wives of Windsor yet, because Falstaff is in that play a great deal, and I regret having never seen these plays staged. I haven't seen Henry IV Part 1 or 2 on stage. I've only seen one adaptation, the Hollow Crown series from BBC, and while those are wonderful, 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 I wish I had more of a background on these plays because they're so fascinating and there's so much going on. You get English history with the conflict in Part 1 between Henry Percy and Henry IV, and you also get another sort of issue in Part 2, and you also have the whole transition of a prince becoming a king, and it's also really interesting for me to read because I never had an interest in kingship and never really understood the appeal of princes and kings and stuff growing up, especially being an American. Monarchy is kind of this strange either fairy tale concept or something that we left behind in the 1700s. But reading these plays really gives me a different view on monarchy and kind of being like, interesting, now I kind of get why, yeah, I get that now. And that, I think, really helps set up for Henry V, where I have a lot more, at least, respect for a king, where I wouldn't before. I'd be like, I don't understand the appeal of marrying a prince. I don't understand the appeal of having this heroic person, but watching the process of Hal growing up and becoming who he is really does help you appreciate him more as a monarch. And it would be interesting to know what Shakespeare thought of Henry V, since he's one of the more positively represented kings. He's not totally positive. He definitely has super, super strong flaws, but he's far more positive than Richard III. So there you go. There's a really brief overview of Prince Hal and Falstaff. I mean, there are loads of essays written on these two characters, I'm certain of it, and so much more to say. I would love to talk about the beginning of Henry IV Part 2, which introduces the character Rumor, which is the only time that character shows up, but super, super fascinating. But this video is probably already long enough with me meandering on and talking about Falstaff. So I'm going to end it here for today. Next week, I'm hoping to talk about Othello, which I should actually be seeing the evening after I make the vlog. So that'll be kind of a nice introduction for me to go see it. So that'll be next week then. Cheers, guys.